Hello everyone, this is James from JB Design and Manufacturing. Today's video is going to be covering how to build the Ender Extender 400XL for the Ender 3 Pro. The previous video goes over how to disassemble the Ender 3 Pro, so please be sure to go back to that video if you need to know how to do that. So, starting now, we'll be going right into the build process.
Alright, so to start with converting the Ender 3 Pro into the extender, what we need to make sure is that we have it dismantled, the Ender 3 Pro that is. And I did that in the previous video, so please go back and check out the link in the description if you want to see that again. But at this point, everything's dismantled, and what I'm going to be doing is starting with building the actual bottom frame. You're going to need 4 pieces, so basically 2 pieces from the actual extender, okay, which are going to be these 2 pieces here, okay. And a very important part of this to note is how the pieces look. You're going to see on one side there are 2 holes here and here, but there is no pre-cut hole above it, okay, basically just to give you a bolt to easily slide into place, okay. If you flip it over, you will notice there's one side that actually has the rounded out area, so that you could easily slip in a bolt and then you should be good, okay. Keep in mind what these are, because we need to have these pointing in particular directions when we're attaching them to the frame. So these need to be facing outwards, so where you can put the bolts in need to be facing outwards, and you need to have where these need to be facing down, okay. So when we put the bolts straight up into the center cross beam, we can easily do that with the bolts being flush by going into this point. So we have to make sure that we have the right pieces in the right place. So I'm not going to be able to put this here because we need this to be flipped, okay. So this will be good enough for the back side, and this will be good enough for the front side because we have the indentations here and we can easily put it on the edge. Now, key difference that we have with where to actually set this up and bolt this onto your member. So these are the seats that were essentially on the Ender 3 Pro that we just took apart. We're reusing those, and these are just from the Ender's extender kit. What we're going to do is take the bolts that we have. There's a little baggie of bolts that are about this size, as well as the little washers, which I've already placed on the inside of here, okay. These will go to where if you have Ender Pro and you just dismantled that, this will go, sorry, okay, this will go down here, okay, on the bottom portion. These 2 points here is where this beam will go. That's only for the Ender Pro. If you have any other version of Ender, then you're going to have it put at the top. And how do you know which is the top and bottom is where the little rubber piece on the bottom is, where the feet of this are facing down. So that would be the top right here, okay. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the bolts and you're going to put them in, all 8 bolts, all the way around. So the 2 on each side in the back, 2 on each side in the front. But we're not going to fully tighten them up. What we're going to be doing is using a square to make sure that this is squared before we actually tighten the bolts, okay. So we want this thing to be fully square all the way around, so that you're not going to have to worry about things being off kilter when you're actually printing. So okay, so what I have done is loosely put in all the bolts all the way around at this point, and then now what I need to do is take the square, and then I'm going to do is press this up into each corner, making sure that all the flat edges are against a flat edge in some point. And I'm going to take a look, looking above it, and see if there's any slight movements or shifts I need to do before I start actually tightening the screws. Once it looks square, then what I'm going to do is make sure this is tightened, okay? And I'm going to do this all the way around until all four corners are showing perfectly square. Alright, so the next step is, after we've squared up the entire frame and we're ready to go, then we're going to be doing is grabbing these little pieces. So you can see it here. Okay. And what essentially we're going to be doing is preparing these to sit where we need them to be for this cross member here to sit on the center. Okay. So the idea is we're actually going to be sliding these into the bottoms here so that we can pull these down to a bolt from the bottom up, hold these down onto the frame. Okay. Now, to do this, I find that the easiest way is to go ahead and get your bolts, get your washer, go ahead and put this through the bottom so it sticks up. And then we're going to take our little button nut, and so that it needs to be facing so that the rounded portions, or the rounded part, that front part here, is facing down. Okay, so then we're going to do is just kind of get it started on this. Okay, and we're not going to tighten it all the way down because we're going to have to slide this onto the actual member here once we have these in place. But all I'm going to do is just simply do a few turns on here so it stays on. And then what I'm going to do is just do this all the way around. All right, so the next step, what you should have done already is these are now in place, where these little button nuts are going to be able to move up and down, because we're going to be sliding this onto this so that they all kind of connect in. So these do have to be somewhat loose. So if you find that you're binding up when you're trying to slide this into place, then you need to make sure you loosen it up so that the button can come up a little higher so that it can slide into the V slots. Okay. So what I'm going to do, and for those who have the Pro model, you will see these two little holes here and here. That will sit on the bottom where the belt tensioner will be connecting to. So this piece here will kind of slide over. This will be on the bottom. So we want to keep that in mind, that this is the bottom of the central cross beam, or the Y beam, as it sits across like this. Okay, so what I'm doing now is just placing these on top of the little button hooks I've already placed. And you can see it kind of sits in there, can't really move side to side. And then what I'm going to do is flip this over. Okay. And then go ahead and somewhat loosen this so that the nut will turn sideways inside the V slot, and then tighten it up so that it presses this against the central beam. Okay, so you're going to do that for all four sides, and then once we have those in place, then I'll show you what to do for the measurement that we need to be from the back side, or the back side of the Y central beam. Okay, now that you have all four of these bolts in place, what you want to do then is just make sure they're somewhat loosened and that they're definitely still attached. And what we're going to have to do is measure for where the back side of this is going to be. And we know what the back side is in comparison to where this central beam is. What this will tell us is if you don't have the if the belt tensioner does not connect to that end where you have the two holes on each side, that's the back side. That's where the motor is going to be attached to. Okay, so on the motor mount side, what you want to do is get yourself a metric ruler, And what we're going to do is measure from the back plate here. And we're going to move this so that it is 55 millimeters from the edge. Okay, so I have measured this from the back edge here. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you want to be pretty close. Okay, so 55 millimeters. I have that set. Once you have it set, then go ahead and tension the bar down. Now, before you fully tighten these down, though, you want to take your square again, and we're going to make sure that where this cross beam, where this Y beam comes to this beam here, that it is square. Okay. So I'm going to put the square up here, and then make my modifications, or just make my slight adjustments as I'm going around to this corner, this corner, this corner, and then this. Okay, if you check all four of these, then it should be square when it comes to this central beam. All right, so at this point, we now have the entire frame put together. We make sure it's squared off. We left off with making sure that these screws were put in place and tightened, and this is 55 millimeters from the back side where the engine's going to be mounted. Okay, so it should be fully tightened down, fully squared on each corner. We are now going to be putting in these two pieces. These are two stock pieces that are in place, with a slight modification which I did myself. In order to put your screen in place, we're going to have to take out these two bolts, slide the screen in between this mount here and this structural support, and then re-enter the bolts. Okay, the only problem is the screen does not have an additional bolt for this. The instructions for this, for the extender, states that you really only need one bolt to hold this in place. I don't like that idea. I like this to be as rigid as possible. So what I did was use a 7/64 drill bit, marked out where I wanted my second hole to be so it can fit on both ends holes here, and then drilled an additional hole. Okay, did the same thing as well for this the CPU board, which is going to have to slide in here. I wanted also to be able to go through these two holes as well. Okay, so what you're going to have to do once you have your holes drilled, or if you don't, you just want to put in one bolt, and that's perfectly fine. What you're going to have to do is essentially loosen up these bolts, take them out. I'm going to do one side at a time. So I'm just going to pull out these two, slide this in place, put the bolts back in, and also put in the bolts that came with the screen, as well as the board here, the little silver bolts they can do for the top corners where they need to be put. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be doing right now. I'm going to loosen up these two bolts, pop this off, slide this in place, bolt it back in place, then do the other end as well for the screen. Make sure I have those two connected together, and then it should be nice and tightened up. Okay, so the next part is we got our screen in place. We have the CPU board in place. So what we're going to do now is run the extra long screen serial cord so that we can get this thing ran underneath here and eventually to our box. So what I'm going to be doing is basically just flipping this upside down so I have access to the serial port, and I'm going to be connecting this to EXP1. Okay, and then what I'm going to be doing is essentially feeding this through the frame and kind of stuffing this into the Z slot behind this rail. So then it runs to here, and then, you know, we're not having too much cord just laying around. You can also use zip ties to hold this in place. There's also some 3D printed clips that you can actually put in place as well, and that'll hold it in place. I'm just going to be using zip ties just to make sure that my stuff's held in place. So when I get this stuff stuffed in. Okay, now that the ribbon has been secured in place, connected to the CPU board, that's all we're going to do with it for now. I did put zip ties in these locations just to make sure they don't pop off. There are also some 3D printed clips you can do as well that can make these more hidden if you don't like the look of the zip tie on the outside of the bar. So you can always look those up on Thingiverse. I'm pretty sure they're on there. Now, for the next step, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting on the carriage. So, in order for us to do that, we're going to flip this back over. Okay. And what we're going to do is basically start installing the carriage. So, you're going to need your carriage here. You're going to need your Y belt from the extender kit. You would need your Y motor as well as your tensioner. Now that we have all the parts together here, we're going to do is start putting these on to the frame. Now, just a point of information for those who do not have a Pro. If you have essentially the thinner bar for, let's say, the Ender S1, then you're going to have to move your wheels from the insides to the outsides. What you see here are the four most outside points. If you have the Pro, you don't have to worry about that. It's already set up to the widths because basically it uses the same kind of center post width with the Pro. So what we're going to do is simply just slide this on, okay? And then now we're going to be worrying about putting the belts through as well as the tensioner. So what we got to do is then take the pre-existing screws and button nuts that go onto here for the sides. We're going to do that. And then, so we're going to put this in place. We're going to put the Y motor in place as well with the 3 screws that need to go in, and then start running the belts. So first the tensioners and the motor. Okay, so at this point I have my carriage put on. I also made sure that there's no wobble or, you know, wobble up and down like this or side to side, because I know I'd like to get this done now while it's all set up, so there's no question about it later on. And you'll need to reach under it and adjust and all that kind of stuff. I do have loosely fitted the belt tightener on, or the belt tightener on the end here, and then so it has the 2 silver bolts on each side, and then I have back here for the motor have set up the 3 bolts in the back here. And I'll be making adjustments once I have the belt put on to try and get it to be tracking correctly so it's not rubbing up against the wheels or the gears in a bit. But the next step would be installing the Y carriage belt, which you can see here. The way that this gets installed is, first we will take this and kind of slide it into the little slot within the carriage. Okay, so it kind of jams itself in there. Do it so that when when you're putting it into the slot, the tread is facing inwards, so that when it makes the turn into the slot, then the tread will be facing backwards, because what you want is the tread to be able to go around the wheel and connect correctly. Okay. Now you want this little copper piece to be facing upwards, because then it will be scraping against here. The tread should be, if you put it in correctly, the tread should be facing down, so you don't actually see it. So it's going to look like this. And then what you're going to do, once you have it around the wheels, you're going to fish it into the small hole into the back of here, fish it all the way down, and then we're going to pull it up through the hole, wrap it around this wheel, and then bring it all the way to this point. Okay. All right, so at this point I have the belt in place. It should be facing down where the tread goes around the gears. The belt tensioner has been tensioned, and what you want to hear is a nice little twang to your belt when you're for nice and tightness. So yeah, that's pretty good. And just kind of move your carriage back and forth. Make sure that the wheels aren't too tight. What happens if your wheels are too tight? They'll start to get with some flat spots, and you'll know that later on when it sits too long, and the wheels will kind of make a little clunk, 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 clunk noise that you're pulling it across. But this, nice and sound, doesn't move side to side. Belts are nice and in place. Also take note where the gears are. Make sure that the belt is towards the center. So for this, it does progress back to the center the closer it gets to here. And the same goes for the other end as well. You don't want the belt to be rubbing, because eventually it will start wearing away at your belts. All right, so the next part that we need to take care of, you need to go ahead and grab the end stop that goes here for the bed. Okay, so what this prevents the bed from doing, and it's this one here, what this prevents the bed from doing is going too far back and then crashing against the motor block here. So so we're going to be setting this up here. So you can see, if you have the Ender Pro, you're going to already have this little adapter, this black adapter that connects to the actual end stop, and this puts it out to the width that it needs to be coming out to, so that it can impact the tire as it's coming back. So what you got to do, you should already have these little button hooks or button nuts on the back of the two screws. So if you don't, you have to find the two small screws that look like this, and then the two button nuts that you're going to put on here. And we're going to put this for now. We're just going to put this towards the back. We'll have to adjust this to be more specific once we have the nozzle set up, so we know exactly where we need to put this. So okay, so what I'm going to do is set this up, tighten it up, and then show you what to do next. Okay, so now that we have the carriage in place, we're going to go ahead and move forward with actually putting the bed onto this. Okay, what we're actually going to be doing is putting the original bed from the Ender 3 Pro back on here, but we're also going to put the bigger bed essentially on top. Okay, so that's the idea. So we'll still need to use the original bed, the springs, as well as the wheels, and what the Ender 3 Pro, or what the Ender Extender provided, were longer screws for the actual leveling wheels. Also, they also have these little plastic washers, which will be actually used for pressing in between the screw here and the heating bed, so that it doesn't short it out. So, first step is taking this in our huge heating plates, and we're going to start setting it on top. Now, the magnetic side needs to be facing down. And we're going to essentially line this up with the holes here. Now, the two other holes, or the holes for here, they're made for a bigger carriage, which if you feel like upgrading your carriage to something that's larger, just more stability or whatever, you can. But this is made for, this plate is made for both the original Ender 3 Pro plate as well as something that's larger if you want to upgrade it later on. Alright, so lining up the holes, what I got to do is take the extra long screws and we're going to push them up from the bottom to here. We're going to take our little plastic washers, we're going to drop those on top. Okay. And then we're going to take the nut and we're going to put that one on. Now it's going to take me a bit to bring this all the way down, but I'm going to do all four of these off camera and then I'll hop back on and show you these all tightened down. Okay, so at this point, all the screws have been put in place and all the nuts have been brought all the way down with the washers in between. Do need to make sure that the washers, the nylon washers, are in place, because if you have metal washers, it could short out the board. So we don't want the heated plate to be shorting out at all. Okay. Alright, so now that we have all the screws in place with the nylon washer and the locking nut, these are all tightened down, and so that there's no gap between the heated bed and the aluminum surface for the new bed. The next step is we're going to be grabbing those springs that we had from the Ender 3 Pro, and we're going to put these in place. Now, if you have other springs, like yellow springs or something like that, that you have instead that are more supportive, or silicone spacers to put in place, go ahead and put that in at this point. Now, we can also include this wire tension reliever for the bed, and I'm going to be placing this right on top of the spring, and this will be going out essentially the back left hand corner of this. Okay, now in order for me to put this onto the carriage, this tends to be a somewhat tricky part. What we're going to be doing is actually putting this onto its side, and then we'll be putting it on that way. It's just a little easier, because if we try and do it just plopping it on, springs will fall off and all that stuff. So what we got to do is take this and we're going to angle it up. We're going to put this into the carriage where the holes are for the wheels, tensioning wheels, and we slide it in place. All right, so it took a little bit more effort than I thought it was going to be, but we got the bed onto the carriage, and now what we're going to do is put our tensioning wheels on, or leveling wheels, I should say. Okay, and then now the bed is installed. The bed should clear your monitor right here by about a half a centimeter, but it will clear. The only thing I do now is just reposition the belt tensioner back here, and then I'll be putting the cover on top of it. And that should help prevent it from getting pulled out the back. So the bed is now installed. Okay, so for the very next part, what we're going to be doing is putting together the carriage, the X carriage it is. And basically we're going to need a few things. For one, you're going to need this piece here. Okay, this is the end that came off of the X carriage off of the Pro, right? You're going to need these little black screws. There's 4 of these, also from the Pro. You are also going to need the guide for the belt right here, and you will also need the extruder, the stepper motor for the extruder with the carriage as well, with the end stop too. You will need your new Bowden tube that comes with the kit. This is longer than the one that's previously there. You can see by how much, by matching it up. So probably about 2.5 to 3 inches longer. Okay. And then you also have your belt that will be feeding through here once we have this in place. Okay. Now, the next step is going to be essentially putting this all in onto the actual bar. So the bar that we're using is the one that has the 3 holes on each side, okay? And we're looking at the divot section right there, where you're going to be able to rest this bolt here, or the bolt head, inside of that, okay? And that's why it's there, just to make sure it sits nice and flush. We're then going to level this up, and we're going to put the two black screws through each end. Okay. Going to make sure you tighten that up, and then on the other side, this is where you're going to be putting your belt guide in place. Okay, so you're basically just going to line up the button nuts in place, and then you'll tighten these up to make sure they lock on. I'm going to push this all the way in, because when we actually do put the belt all around, it's just easier to have the tensioning guard all the way in, just to slide it on more easily. Okay. The other side that needs to be covered is going to be this. I'm going to put this on right now, simply because it's just easier to put it on. I already have it tensioned where it needs to be anyways. So I'm just going to pop this on and push it across the center. Okay, and there's our, and I'll be fine-tuning this in a minute, but for the time being I'm just going to leave it on so I can more easily put this on too as well. This guy is going to require you to slide this into place. This bolt will sit inside this section here. You can see there's a little bit of a divot cut out right there. That's where this bolt sits, okay? And you're going to be pushing this onto the outside. The access point, so if you remember when dismantling this, the access point for where you put in the screws is going to be through these two holes back here. You're going to put these two screws in place and tighten. Okay. Now that we have all the bolts locked up for the two blacks on this one and the two black ones on this one, these are nice and tight, so it should not be an issue. What we're going to do now is actually install the belt. Okay. Now, in order to install the belt, we need to flip this over, and what we're going to do is take this, and with the tread facing down, we're going to slide this into this little groove here, just like this. Tread faces down. This needs to happen in order for us to go around the pulley on this end, or the gear on this end, so it gets, so it bites. Okay, we're going to feed this through here. Trying to get this above the wheel. Go ahead and do it this way. Okay, we got it around the wheel. Then what I want to do, hold this in place, and then drop it down the other side of the wheel. Go. Now we're going to have to drop this right below the wheel. So this is going to go right under them, just like in the Ender Pro, or your Ender in general. Okay. So I'm going to slide this through here, wrap this back around, and then lock it under here. Now, once you have the belt in place and slid in place, it is going to be loose. Okay, so what we need to be doing is putting the tensioner, loosening these things up, slide this back as far as we can, then lock it down so that the belt, you want the belt to be somewhat taut, just like you did for the belt here. Okay, you want it to be tight, because you don't, if it's too loose, then it'll start skipping on the gear, and then you'll start skipping steps. Okay, so tensioner is tight. The belt is on there nice and taut. It's not too tight, but at the same time, it's not going to be breaking loose or skipping on the actual gear. The next step is going to be introducing the new Bowden tube that you see here. So we're just going to push this in. And then we're going to push this into the extruder motor coupler. Okay. And now we have this installed. If you wish to start zip tying these onto the actual tube, you're more than welcome to. I'm simply going to wait until I know for sure, when everything's set up, where the tensioning needs to be on the wires and that sort of stuff. So I'm going to wait on that. But this is now complete. Now we're ready to put up the vertical struts that come up the top. Now, in order for you to do that, you're going to need these two extruded aluminum supports. The one that has the two holes here, these two holes will be sitting closest to the bed. That's where the power supply will be put if you're going to keep it external beside the bed. The other option you could do is actually put the power supply underneath this bed. There's an option just to get it out of the way. I plan on putting some vertical supports on this to make this a little bit more rigid. And simply for the reason I've already pre-installed these before and they will not be perfectly square. So to get these things perfectly square, we'll then put the supports on it, and then that should help square it off and it should be fine. But I'm going to be using like squared or threaded rod or something like that with some 3D printed parts to kind of pull this into the square position. But for the time being, I'm going to install these just as they're intended to. All right, so the way you're going to install these, oh, and for the left-hand side, you need to install it where the two holes here are at the bottom, okay? So you're going to be grabbing 4 of the bolts that we used with the Ender 3 Pro, okay? So these kind of bolts here with the washers on them. These are what we're going to use to tie these into these side beams to get them straight up. Make sure they're nice and tight. Not much you can do for adjustments to keep them level. So you're just going to have to keep them tight, and then later on when you get your vertical supports for these guys, they'll be more rigid and at 90 degrees. All right, so the bars are now on, the vertical stabilizers. What we're going to do next is go ahead and slide this over the top, and then we're going to be doing the tensioning on it to make sure it is properly put onto this bar. Okay. Now, a good way to check to make sure that your wheels are properly on, if you notice that it starts to rock like this, that means there's a little too much play and we need to adjust the concentric bolts that are here, as well as the one that is located over here. Okay, so it's just 2 bolts. Basically, when you turn these, you'll start to feel like if you're able to hold this and the wheel spins freely, that means it's not tight enough. Okay, so if you're noticing that and it's not moving anywhere and you're moving it up and down, then yeah, it's a little too loose. If you're noticing that it's shaking, too loose. So what we got to do is get a wrench and start adjusting this, pulling it closer. Okay, not much jiggle on this side. Now you want to fix this one. Okay, pretty stable, and a nice ride going down. Okay, so that's a good that is a good motion for this. So there's no wobble really with this, besides the actual frame wobbling with this table. Pretty solid in place, should be good. In the future, what I do plan on doing is putting a second Z rod in place, or Z motor in place, to help keep these both going up at a steady rate, so there's no drooping. You know, with the longer carriages here, one end will slightly droop, just inevitable. So in the future, that'll be one of the upgrades. But at this point, it's all in order. Okay, so the next step is going to be putting the power supply onto the support. If you didn't catch the text earlier, I did make a mistake. The holes I said were supposed to be on the inside. These are actually pushed to the outside. With the Ender Pro 3, they were actually on the inside, and it did have enough clearance if it was put on. so that it would just be just off the table. But you know, for some reason they decided to push it to the outside. So anyways, all you have to do is take the 2 silver screws. You're going to place this here. If you're planning on installing this onto the actual pillar here, do that instead of underneath, where some people might relocate, which I may very well do some other time. But for the time being, this guy will be installed here. Okay. Okay, so for the next thing we're going to install, it's going to be the end stop for the Z. Right now we don't know exactly where to set this, but what I do want to do is set this so that this is not sitting on the build plate, because I don't want to scratch in the build plate. Doesn't really matter if it does or not, but I just put wear on the nozzle. And then once I have it in place, the T-nuts, or the button nuts behind it, will essentially lock this in place. Just tighten this up. Okay, and now this thing is effectively holding this thing up. Now you may notice that the little tab doesn't actually sit on the frame. That's because this is much higher than what it was on the Ender 3 Pro. So you're going to have to raise this up, so it's not sitting on the tab, it's just raised up to a level that's more manageable. Later on we'll adjust this once we have once I get the glass bed being put on top. Then I'll lower this down to a more manageable height to where I can level it and it'll be fine. Okay, after that, then we're going to install the Z stepper motor, and we're going to need these little black screws, flathead screws from the Ender 3 Pro. Okay, and what we're going to do is just put this on here. Use an Allen key. You're going to have to hold this up a little bit just to get it started, because the motor will stay off of the surface of this. And the main reason for that is to prevent any kind of vibrations that could happen from the stepper. Okay, so once you have the 2 screws in place here, do keep in mind that we will be making subtle adjustments to this motor to try and make sure that it is perfectly straight when we put in the Z-rod. So that's what we're going to be doing next, is putting in our Z-rod. And what you're going to do is simply slide this in place within next to the stepper. And then this will drop inside the coupler within the stepper motor. Make sure the coupler is loose so it's able to accept this, no issue. Alright, and this is where you can kind of see how to straighten this up. So if you're looking at the bar as it's coming straight up, you want it to be perfectly straight. Okay, so this is where we're going to make our adjustments. So we're going to loosen up these screws for here on the stepper. This is side for easier seeing. Okay, and you can be able to wiggle this kind of side by side. What we want is this coupler to be perfectly straight with the actual insert that hugs the Z-rod. Okay, so we want this to be somewhat straight. So we're making sure that that's the case. Once we have it down where it needs to be, I'm going to tighten it up. And also tighten up the coupler so it stays on the screw. Alright, so the next step is going to require us to install all the extensions for the wiring. So for the power wire, there is a new extension, so you might as well just take the old power wire extension from the board, and you're just essentially just going to remove it. And then you're going to install this. You're also going to be installing extensions for your bed, the heating unit for the bed, using these little things here. To actually install them, you just lift these all the way up like this, shove the wire in, and then pop them back in place. Okay, and it should be nice and snug inside of it. Okay, all these are fans. Okay, so you have your connections for your fans. These are extensions. The only thing you have to really worry about is remembering what color is what for your connections to the board. So you just got to remember that. And this would be the heating unit for the or the sensor for the bed. Okay, the thermistor for it. So yeah, we got extensions for the thermistor for the heat block. We have a fan, one of the parts fans extensions. We have the cooling fan for the heating unit. I've already soldered these together, and I'm going to be pulling these little sleeves over top and covering them up and heating them up to melt in place. And then we also have an extension for I already said the heating unit for the actual heating block. Okay, so all the extensions are on there. I'm going to go ahead and move these over the two solder points, and then heat them up, solidify them in place, and then I'm going to start pulling all the wires and connecting them to the actual CPU board, which is under here. Okay, and then just basically dressing up all the wires just to make it look neat and position them where they're best to be positioned. So that's the next step. All right, so the next step is going to be installing the motor and end stop connections. So we got all these extensions will be coming in the kit. So for the Y and your X axis up here, you will get all these wires. The only one that you'll have to reuse is going to be the one that's connected to your end stop here for the Z. Okay, so this one is the only one that's reused because it's a short distance, so you'll be able to get away with using that again. Okay, but you're going to run all your wires through, connect them all into place, and eventually we're going to be installing them into the CPU board, which is the next step. And the very last thing to do for building this kit will be putting this top piece on. So one of the most important things you need to make sure you do is that there is that little divot like the other pieces where the bolts would actually sit flush with inside here. So make sure that the divots are facing upwards. You can put 2 screws on each side, and that should put it all together. All right, so just to start this thing up so you can see that it actually works. Now what this does not have is the custom firmware, so at this point it's not going to be homing correctly because it's set up for the Pro. So I'll be doing another video on that shortly, on actually how to edit the firmware and then load it onto the printer, so that's good to go. But for now, the huge printer will be sitting here, and I'll be picking up my new mirror for the top surface, possibly some stronger glass or thicker glass later on, because I know that this big plate here is pretty, it's definitely warped in certain spots, so might need the thicker glass to kind of straighten it out. We'll see. But for now, that's going to do it for the build.
Alright, so that's going to do it for this video. My thoughts on the whole process. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a great printer to be working with. There were some things that I'm slightly concerned about, such as the bed leveling, or the sheet of aluminum that came with it being warped. So I will be addressing that with a piece of glass in the near future. Also, the thing I'll be addressing is the vertical stabilizers for the vertical supports. It's right now it's slightly off 90 degrees, and I need to address that with some support bars that will pull it into place. Other things I'm also maybe including within some future videos for this is going to be a new CPU box. The one that currently, or how it's currently set up, is quite wide open. I'm not a fan of that, so I'm going to be addressing that with a custom made box that I will be designing. Also, we'll be addressing the firmware, so that'll be the very next video, which I'll be going over how to install how to create custom firmware for this and how to actually install it. I'm sure there'll be some other things that will be addressed with this video too in the future. So just if you want to make sure that you're up to date with this, go ahead and subscribe. I'll just keep going with this playlist, and hopefully it's going to be able to assist you later on. Please be sure to leave me any comments for any suggestions that you need, or suggestions that you would give me, and then I'll try and address them as quickly as I can. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you guys at the next video.